So I'd like to welcome Bill Engelke, AB4EJ, who we first started our collaboration, actually both Scotty and Bill and I, we've all started our collaborations by meeting at Hamvention, Hamventions in the past. A few years ago, Bill came up and he had written a website that aggregated RBN PSK reporter data, or it was just DX spots, right? DX cluster spots.
Yeah, that is still running.
Yeah.
DX, DXDisplay.caps.edu,
yeah.
ua.edu.
So he wrote this website and wrote a little article on QRZ, and he dropped a copy of the article off at, I think, my very first HamSci booth ever at Hamvention, and I said we should work together, and here we are. So, Bill Engelke from the University of Alabama.
Thanks very much, Nathaniel. A lot of what I'm doing kind of builds on what Diego has been doing. As you can imagine, plotting this data out and then searching it by hand, the labor intensiveness of that really works against you, especially if you want to do a lot of different geographical areas and a lot of different time periods. So one of the things that I have been working on, and this is funded by a NASA grant actually, is ways to find these traveling ionospheric disturbances automatically in the data. And it is a non-trivial problem because, well, I'll show you why in a minute. Okay, Veronica did a great job in explaining what a TID is. If you're active on the ham bands, you will have experienced these as QSB fading, background noise that goes up and then comes down because, well, the ionosphere, when it gets enhanced, it's going to reflect more noise as well as signal. So these things, you experience them. We can see the waves in spot data, and I'll show you that in a minute. It's very similar to what Diego has been working with. So what I've been developing is a machine learning technique to recognize these patterns in these plots. Now, the SuperDarn system is an HF radar. Over here you can see one of the beams. There are lots of these, and this is the one that seems to cover North America the best. And so I use this one. This is transmitted from Blackstone, Virginia, and it is beam number 4 if you're really looking closely at the details. It sweeps back and forth across North America, and the receiver looks for a returning signal, and it can actually tease out the difference between ground scatter and other types of reflections. The ground scatter is interesting because it enables us to recognize TIDs in the data. So here is a plot from Blackstone. On the y-axis you have the distance, and on the x-axis you have time. So you can see these sinusoidal patterns that were talked about earlier in this data. Period of 1 to 4 hours. So you can have these very long, and relatively short. They're also medium scale ionospheric disturbances that run like 30 minutes to an hour. They're harder to see because there's noise in this. So you've got waves going in various different directions at the same time, and they constructively and destructively interfere with each other because you're only looking at one reflection signal. So, now, spots, these are signal reports. You get them on PSK Reporter, WhisperNet, and RBN. It's simply, when you boil it down, you got 2 call signs, and you know one of them heard the other one. You know the frequency, and you know when it occurred. And in some cases, you have a signal-to-noise ratio. But what's really important is that the signal was there, was heard. And these are being generated by the millions now. I mean, FT8 has taken off like gangbusters, and that's what lots of people are running. It constitutes something like 80% of the spots that are reported to Logbook of the World, from my understanding. And so a lot more contacts are being made, and you find out about every one of them because most of them get uploaded to PSK Reporter. Same thing with WhisperNet and RBN. There's just a lot more of this kind of thing going on now. So there is spot data for some areas that are not covered anywhere by the HF radar. So SuperDawn and other things, they're not everywhere, but hams are. So we can study some things where this is the only data that there is. So what do we look at? The x-axis. Okay, first, I'm doing this just with data from 20 meters because it's very clear. It's a tractable problem. And I'm just looking at it from 1200 to 2400 UTC in North America, because that's when the band is open during the day. That's when 20 meters is open. The y-axis is the signal in distance in kilometers, and the point color is the number of spots this minute at this range. So down there you see the corresponding plot of the spot data. And this scale here, the higher it is towards the red, the more spots have been detected at that range during that time frame. So each pixel, its color, shows you how much signals we're making through it at that range on 20 meters, 20 meter in this case. This is combined RBN, Whisper, and PSK, but I can tell you from having looked at the data, 90 to 95% of this data is coming from PSK. So you can see where you have some sinusoidal looking components in this data, these things that indicate coming and going of propagation at that distance. There's also another phenomena that we see from time to time, which we don't yet know what it is. Nathaniel coined this a PEP, a periodic enhanced propagation. Don't know if this is just an artifact of processing or if it's actual enhancement, as though a wave of higher density was coming through at a regular interval. See there, and sometimes you see these lines. So this is something that's kind of irrelevant to what I'm talking about, but it's something interesting showing up that we intend, it's one of those, that's funny, that we intend to look into. Now, what about the machine learning aspect of this? You don't call it artificial intelligence anymore because it's not really there's no intelligence involved. All we're doing is we're training a neural network to look for something that has a certain look to it. We can look at these plots and identify something that looks like a transient ionospheric disturbance by just looking at it. So I'm using a software package called TensorFlow. This was originally developed by Google. It's now gone to an open source model. Anybody can get it. It's free. There's a learning curve in learning how to use it, and it's training something is kind of intensive, labor intensive. But once you got it trained, then you can use it to identify things in images very quickly. So the idea is we're going to manually identify those shapes in these plots that we know from experience constitute transient ionospheric disturbances. Then we're going to train the system to look for those. So if you're going to do training, there's a tutorial on this that trains you in which you train your system to identify the cards of a pinochle deck. I mean, it's very pedestrian at this level. So you take your training images and you split them 80% for training and 20% for test. And test means it's going to compare against an image to see how close the model is to finding what it's supposed to find. So you have to go through your images and mark the features. So I plotted using this method here about 5 years worth of data, daily plots for 5 years. Then went through them. What you have to do is you have to identify ones that have this sinusoidal looking pattern and then draw boxes around those areas that appear to be part of a TID. And the system saves a file of that, and then when you go through and run your training cycle, it's going to train the system to look for those kinds of features in new images that you show it, novel images it hadn't seen before. This is, if you're a machine learning geek, you're going to recognize this. This is just a plot of the system showing how its error decreases with more and more training. Now, if you're going to do this, you want to have a system with a GPU in it, because this training could be done in about a half a day with a GPU-based system. It would take about 5 days of crunching on your machine to do it without a GPU installed. And it's a royal pain to get the GPU configured to work. So, but it pays off later. So the way it works is, now the detector program searches an image for a sub-image that looks like the object it was trained to look for. So we trained it to look for these sinusoidal patterns. It's going to try and find them in new images. Now, here's an example where we take this. Here's an example of something that it hadn't seen before. It's in the year 2020. The training was done 2015 through 2019. So it's going to look at this and see if it finds any sinusoidal patterns in there. And it comes up with draws a little box around the area that it thinks represents the pattern of interest. So, and it gives a score. Now, this is an awfully high score, this 100% confidence. So, it's just a score. Apparently, this pattern that you see here is very similar to something that was in the training data. Something happens in the ionosphere similar to this. So here, if we look at the superdarn plot, we see corresponding sinusoidal patterns. So it looks like it found something that seems to agree with the superdarn plot. So that's good. Now here is something where it draws a box around something, and when I first looked at this, I thought, oh, man, was there an error here? I don't see anything here. Well, it turns out that, yeah, this is a traveling ionospheric disturbance that's at or slightly below the lower threshold. It's something slightly less than an hour in period, and you don't really see it very well manually when you look at this. But the system says the data in there indicates that we have a TID in this image, even though you can't see it. And we do see evidence of a TID of a very short period in that radar data. Now, you can't always do this. We don't have plots for every day on the superdarn system. The system's sometimes taken down for a month at a time for maintenance and other things. And you can't get much data during certain months of the year, and so anyway. So now that we have this, what do we use it for? Well, Diego talked about climatology. He spent an awful lot of time looking at the climatology of a single year, and in an hour or two, I was able to run this against 6 years worth of data. And lo and behold, we found a similar pattern to what Diego found. And we see a little bit of change as we get towards the higher end of the solar cycle. So that's one of the things we're going to be doing, taking a look to see, now that we have this powerful tool that can go through and look at all this stuff very quickly, we can do a lot more analyses relatively quickly and do things like, well, does the solar, what impact, if any, is there on the on the climatology of traveling ionospheric disturbances from changes in the solar cycle itself? And this is the kind of analysis that we can now do. So we need to look at other continents to see how it compares and is it reversed in Australia, as you would expect, because the seasons are opposite? That's what we're going to figure out. So that kind of concludes. Just to summarize, the system can examine several images per second. This thing is fast enough. When GPU accelerated, you can even analyze live video in real time. It lets us study years of propagation reports, and we plan to do some correlation analysis. But the idea is to better understand TIDs, the influence of various factors on HF propagation, because that influences things like the accuracy of GPS data and things like radio astronomy. And anytime you're looking through the atmosphere or using the ionosphere to reflect or refract, these TIDs play some kind of a role. Even if it's a very small role, they play some kind of a role. So that concludes my presentation. Thanks very much to NASA for the funding on this, and open the floor for any questions. Question over here.
Uses the term traveling, and I just wanted to have a good understanding of what you mean.
Yeah, why do I use the word traveling? It's because my brain is probably confused. Is that the right word, or is it transient?
Traveling.
Traveling is the right word. Well, it travels through the ionosphere as a wave. It goes across the continent, as opposed to being a phenomenon that just happens in one place. I guess that's probably the cogent explanation. So, in the back, in the black shirt.
So, using the superdarn data for correlation versus the actual spots, the superdarn is directional, correct? So these waves are going in direction.
It sweeps across the, but it is what we say. It's confined to cover mostly the continental U.S., North America, most of the continental U.S. And when I take my spot data, I can put a geofence around what data I use. So there was another question. Yeah.
Just quick, because you mentioned with the TIDs and QSB, are TIDs the predominant source of QSB data?
I'd
Well-
say it's a very common source, if not the predominant source. I mean, we see these traveling ionospheric disturbances all of the time, not only large-scale ones, but especially in the fall and winter, you see medium-scale ones as well. So it's a very common sort of thing. So it would also be a common source of QSB.
Yeah, I mean, if you take a look at the mechanism which is occurring, you've got a band of ionosphere that you're refracting off, and when that band starts moving up and down, you can prove using just geometry that the signal, where the signal is landing, is going to move back and forth too. Yeah.
When you're looking at the spot data, you have to make allowances for, activity, like the weekends, more people on the air and so on.
The amount of, well, put it this way, we're getting tens of millions of spots per day all the time. And so sometimes you get more, but the way we're plotting it is you're counting the number of spots you had at a particular distance, and the distance is what? You could certainly see effects from contest weekends, but you've got such a large, that kind of gets swamped by the vast number. This is a big data problem, and let me tell you what, as a data scientist, it's kind of challenging to work with, because Okay, you got a training set. You got 1,500 files, each 3 to 5 gigabytes, analyze. Okay, well, that's going to take a while. So, yeah. Yeah.
So the actual data you're feeding, it's not the raw data itself, but you're actually feeding the image files of the graph? Is that what it's looking at?
Right. It's a two-step program. You have to take the data that comes from RBN, PSK, etc., process it to geolocate it and pre-process it. Then you process that into the images. Because you have to geofence it and you have to pick out, you've got all kinds of different frequencies that are in the PSK reported data from any given day. They're doing PSK all the way from 2,200 meters up to gigahertz. So you have to pick out the data that you need and then plot that. Then you use that for your machine learning because that's what's most directly comparable to the superdarn plots. That's what we were going for. Something you could put the plots together and look at them. And if you can recognize it with your eye, then you can train the machine learning system to look for it. I think we're probably running out of time. How are we doing on time?
We are technically out of time.
Okay, so thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you so much for coming, everyone. I look forward to seeing you in the future. Look for announcements soon about the upcoming HamSci workshop. Our target is going to be to have it in March again. It'll be corresponding with the University of Scranton spring break, so we'll be getting that information out. Thank you.